Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. We're pleased to be joined by many people from all over the continent and beyond. Today's webinar that the Global Investigative Journalism Network is hosting will be the second for this year, and it is titled Fresh Approaches to Packaging Investigative Content. I find this extremely exciting, and we do have a great panel to look forward to today. My name is Moturayo Alaka. I am the Executive Director, CEO of the Wole INK Centre for Investigative Journalism, which is based in Lagos, Nigeria. As we all are aware, investigative journalism is what many people will call the hard news. This is very tough stuff. It is systematic, it is in-depth, it seeks to, unearth those things that people want hidden, and it is serious business. However, we're in this digital age where, we're in the click-happy age. Our audiences have short spans of attention. They do not want to read things that are so long. And so how do we present this very important thing that keeps the democracy going, keeps good governance happening to the audience in such a way that it engages them and it builds up the civic space? So we're here today at this session to discuss this. Again, I welcome you. I'd like to introduce our panel, but before then, a bit more about the Global Investigative Journalism Network. This network has about 187 members across 78 countries. And in Sub-Saharan Africa, we have 17 members. GIJN works with journalists everywhere, basically to help them to connect with one another, to also help them to learn more about the work that they do and have a strong network to depend on for support for the work that they do. Please feel free to check the GIJN.org website and subscribe to our newsletter and be a part of the great work that is happening here. Now to our panel. Our first speaker today will be John Allan Namu. He's from Kenya. He's the co-founder and CEO of Africa Uncensored. He's an investigative and in-depth journalism producer. And prior to being at Africa Uncensored, he was the project editor at Kenyan Television Network. We welcome you, John Allan Namu. We'll get back to you shortly. Our second speaker will be Evelyn Brunick. Evelyn is Dutch, but she has spent a lot of time in South Africa, and she's the investigative editor for ZAM magazine, which is very focused on investigative reporting across Africa. She was also part of the co-founders for Forum for African Investigative Reporters that was hosting the PAR conference that is now the Africa Investigative Journalism Conference. ZAM has a huge network of over 70 members in 24 African countries, and the Africa Fair, which Evelyn was part of, also published a number of books in Africa. Nigel Mungamo is our third speaker. He's from Zimbabwe. He's the chief storyteller at 263 Chart. It is an alternative news platform that does everything, including investigative reports, and encourages dialogue and increase in access to information in Zimbabwe. Our last speaker, definitely not the least, is Tembela Ntongana, and she's the digital coordinator with Ama Bungane from South Africa. Ama Bungane is an investigative journalism organization focusing primarily on exposing political corruption in South Africa and neighboring countries, and they have quite some interesting things. So this webinar will be about 75 minutes long. Our four speakers will start by taking turns, 8 minutes each, to lay a foundation. We'll try to have follow-up questions with them. And then my colleague Benon Oluka will come on for the question and answer. And just to let you know, we're recording this webinar. So without further ado, I'm eager to get in on this. We're going to go to John Allan Namu. And John Harlan, at the beginning of one of your videos, which introduced Africa Uncensored, you said, and I quote, "I'm an African journalist. The story I tell are in full, intense color." And I loved the introduction, and I thought I wanted to listen to the rest of the story. Yet, you know, full, intense colors and investigative reporting, sometimes you think, are those things that you mentioned in the same sentence? So I would like to start by asking you to take us through, you know, how you tell, you know, investigative stories in full, intense colors without coloring the truth.
Hi, Monterey, thank you. That's a great question. And hello to everybody who's on the call this afternoon. Great question. So how do we do it at Africa Uncensored? Our method, essentially, because we do a lot of documentary work, is to try as much as possible to be in step with what culturally is acceptable in terms of codes of television or digital content. What I mean by this is that gone are the days when journalism had to be very dry, very stripped of any elements that would, you know, any important storytelling elements that could help improve people's interaction with it. An example that I would give is a lot of the streamers that you have today, Netflix, you know, Amazon Prime, etc., have lots of documentaries, some of them investigative, that borrow codes from thriller or non-fiction or fiction genres of content. And the expectation from audiences is that you'd be able to you know, produce at that kind of level. So what we try and do is, without coloring the truth, try and borrow some of these codes, try and see whether our storytelling can be more impactful, more in step with what we find. And that has served us very well. The second thing that we've done, full and intense color can also be perceived as what culturally does your audience, what kind of content culturally does it consume, and also in what language. And I think language is a very important thing. One of the things that we've done more recently with some of the work that we've done is that we started to produce content in Sheng, which is a slang, which is slang between Kiswahili, English, a combination of different languages. It's a lingua franca here in Nairobi, in Kenya. And it's a language spoken by pretty much everybody, especially younger audiences. And in so doing, what we're able to do is to reach a lot more different demographics in terms of the work that we do, and get them to engage with the content because it felt much more real to them. So I think that's what we're trying to do. We're really trying to improve our storytelling without harming or interfering with the mores and the traditions of investigative journalism, or trying to be sensational to the extent that it becomes less than truthful. I think that's the way I'd answer that question.
Okay, thanks for that. I'll move quickly to, I'll come back to you, John Allen. I'll move quickly to Evelyn for now and ask Evelyn, ZAM has over 1,200 creatives in investigative journalism. And I was excited to read about, you know, you doing photography, the art, opinion, you know, in African countries and the diaspora. Can you share practical tips on how to merge, you know, that sort of creativity with investigative reporting for content that reaches a wide range of audiences?
It is an enormous challenge. In fact, we've just had an entire seminar with quite a few ZAM people in Amsterdam to discuss precisely that. We actually came back to an experience that we had. Many of us, not all of us, but many of us actually have a history in support for the struggle against apartheid in South Africa ages ago. There was a Dutch anti-apartheid movement that was, well, I'm showing how old I am, that was quite strong. And one of the big things that happened to rally the Dutch community, Dutch only, we try now to go for the whole of Europe and the Western world, so to speak, one thing that happened was to show all that creativity that came from South Africa. It was South Africa only at that point in time. Then we became very ambitious and megalomaniac, and we said, no, we're going to do the same thing for, when it comes to the African continent, because we go for Western audiences, basically because we are from there, but also because there are so many stereotypes and things that are harmful still thought about the continent of Africa in Western societies. Like, there's those narratives of everybody's hungry, everybody's sad, everybody's miserable, we must help them. And then that them becomes like an amorphous mass of people without any social struggles or differences or differentiations. And our development aid money ends up supporting like somebody like Yoweri Museveni in Uganda and police that are doing things that you wouldn't exactly want to support. But that's because of a lot of misunderstandings and stereotypes, and also interests. I mean, there are interests that align with those of the elites that are in power in some places. So in that sense, the creativity shows you truth, what is really happening in countries, what the poets are doing, what the musicians are doing. I mean, it's not a coincidence that a lot of resistance in Uganda rallies around a musician, Bobi Wine, and there are many, many examples like that. So that creativity, in the times of the anti-apartheid movement, we showed South African artists, writers, musicians, we had festivals, but it was for the purpose of showing that this was a country, and now it would be a continent, worth knowing better. And when it comes to impacting on that continent, in terms of development aid or partner countries or whatever. I mean, Africa, sadly, is subject to so many important international role players. And there are good effects from that, but also sometimes very bad effects from that. So you need to know a lot of truth about these African countries, because your leaders in the West are engaging. And decisions about what happens there are partly taken in partnership with African elites that investigative journalists are busy investigating for all kinds of things. Yeah, so that's basically that. I want to add that we chose a transnational approach because what we find to combat those stereotypes and and ask the question, if we are engaged with Africa, which we are, I mean, we can't choose not to be engaged with Africa because we're getting a whole lot of natural resources from there. And our governments are doing a whole lot of things that impact there. So we can't say we're not engaged, we are. So the question is, how are you engaged? In what way can you support things like democracy, transparency, accountability of leaders, development, all those things. And to bring that message across, now I come to packaging. We have found that we don't achieve much when we say there is a corruption scandal in Tanzania, because corruption is one of the stereotypes. Then people, and even in Africa itself, I don't know if you've read a recent study done by the Democracy in Africa website on how all the corruption reporting in African countries itself is actually sometimes discouraging communities from even trying to effect change and from trying to hold their leaders accountable, because it's like corruption is everywhere and you can never do anything about it, and this is just the way it is. So we engage with change, with creativity, with thinking about the future. And we can only do that if I'm coming back, sorry, to if we adopt the transnational approach that shows the parallels in post-colonial issues that happen in a lot of African countries where elites captured state power, which is a hell of a lot of African countries. And then you get all these problems of mismanagement and so on. So in a way, we say Africa is a country, which is wrong. It is untrue that Africa is a country, I know this, but in order to break down the barriers and to show all the stuff that is the truth about Africa, you have to say, guys, look at this post-colonial kleptocracy in Uganda, in Kenya, in the DRC, in a lot of countries. And this is something you, international audience, must engage with, because you and your leaders are often supporting the wrong people here.
All right, thanks so much, Evelyn. And I like the points that you make about corruption also becoming fast a stereotype. The word being used in titles becoming a stereotype. At the INK Centre for Investigative Journalism, we do a lot of media monitoring, and I'm coming straight to you, Nigel, now. We do a lot of media monitoring, and we find that a lot of times important stories, for instance, about electricity, about oil and gas, which are really critical in our country, they are extremely technical too, and nobody reads them because people can't understand what are they talking about. We don't know how this relates to us. How does this affect the cost of food in the market, like it's often said in Nigeria? So, so I'm coming to you now, Nigel, and I'm asking, you have a platform and you host up to 200 WhatsApp groups to pass along your message. That's crazy. So what kind of engagement and what kind of understanding of audience does one need to have to be able to package, news that is so hard for these kind of groups to engage with? And what are the biggest lessons that you can share with us on that?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a long journey. I think 263 chat turns 10 in September. So, I sit on the product side of things. So the business side of things, and we're always trying to figure out how do we reach our intended community. I think it's great that we create the content, but then we also have to think about the end user. So how do they receive it? So why WhatsApp? Why did we turn to WhatsApp? So in my former life, I used to be an accountant. So I'm a number cruncher, right? Number cruncher turned journalist. And so I still love numbers, and I still consume. I still love numbers. So we looked at the telecoms regulator here, and they publish a report every quarter, and we simply looked at where are these people. We looked at the census, last census that we had. What's the majority of people? And we worked out that over 65% of the population are under the age of 35. So you got young people. The 52% of the population are women. And another 67% of the population are rural. So how do you find these people, right? And how do you talk to them every day in a way that they understand? So we found that sharing something in WhatsApp, because the telecom providers have created a WhatsApp bundle, that's one of the easiest ways to reach them. So find them on WhatsApp. So how do we get them to come around the brand? Oh, why don't we create a WhatsApp group? And then we decided to even be, clever, a little bit more, nuanced, and said, how do we create different communities, safe communities, for them to discuss and open up and share and that sort of stuff. And so we've got different types of groups. We've got those who receive the e-paper, electronic paper, which is the PDF newspaper, the Jimbound, group farming, got groups on the mining sector, so guys who are involved in that. We've got jobs, so anyone looking for a job. We basically created groups around what the community wanted. So to give an example, the farming group was a suggestion by one of the community members. We created a well-being group because of COVID. So people obviously, especially that first hard lockdown, people were struggling. And so we created a group to share information on, alcohol abuse and where to get help and stuff like that. So really we've leveraged WhatsApp, and we can't control the price of data. We can't control whether WhatsApp increases the group members from 256 to 1,000. But what we can do is just leverage that piece of technology. And that's really what we've done in reaching our intended community.
Thanks, Nigel. Again, I'll get back to you, but let me quickly speak to Tembela. And I was reading your Twitter handle and it said, we're digging dung to fertilize democracy. That's interesting, but a lot of people don't want to be involved in dung, whatever, whatever happens at the end of the day, whatever good you are doing with it. And then, your story that talked on your website on Amabungani on state capture, and you mentioned that it caused public outrage, and you went on to republish it as a ebook. So I just wanted to share your experience with innovating, with repackaging investigative content in such a way that others want to read it.
Thank you. So in terms of the ebook, so we started experimenting with the ebooks in 2021. And what we did with them was we took some of the big stories that we did, which came in many parts. So for example, Kapowership is one of the biggest stories that we did. I think we did about 10, just 9 or 10 stories on it. And we put it together into one book, which could be downloaded either for your desktop or your cell phone, understanding that our users, majority of our users are cell phone, do use mobile to consume news. And what we did with that is we put these stories together with graphics and explainers and made it, I think, the previous speaker said about how investigative pieces, if I can say, are not really that sexy, because it's a 3,000 to 6,000 word article. There's barely any pictures. And how then what we wanted to look at it, how do we then engage readers who like that content, readers who don't like long form reading, and readers who are below what the age of people who were reading our stories were, which was about 65 years and over. And how do we then engage people the age of 25 till the age of 44 and so forth? And that's when the ebooks then came up. And what we liked with that is because of the way that Amabungane publishes, is we're an investigative journal. We don't have everyday news and therefore don't necessarily have content on a daily basis. What those ebooks then allowed us to do is, bring content or stories that we've done and bring them up again and bring them to the faces of people and say to them, if you haven't engaged with this content, here's something. If you didn't read one story, now you don't have to go back and look for the other 10 stories, but here's an ebook where we've put together all the stories, all the little pieces that we've worked on to put these investigative pieces together, and that worked really well because it was really interactive, and we saw quite a number of people who downloaded these things, and that showed us that it's something that is working. We are obviously quite a small team, and those do take a lot more time to do. And that's why other things that I'm going to speak about in terms of repackaging sort of talk about, if we don't have the capacity then to create the books in the meantime, what other means are we using as Amabungane to sort of still keep fresh and also still repackage the content that we have, that it appeals to different groups of people that we want to read our stories.
Okay. Thank you. I know that you have a slide you'd like to share, but maybe we'll come back to that and you can just run us through. But I wanted to get back to John Allan, since we're talking about repackaging and the way of presenting news in a way that is appealing to audience, because I believe one of the things that I've found in my experience with journalism is that sometimes we get to a position where we totally ignore the audience and we just have a way that we tell our own story, believe in what we're doing, and we just know it's important and we believe they should get it. You have a platform, Shahara, where you package differently. I would like you to talk to that. And I'd like you to talk to also, because of our time, I'd like to also talk to, if someone was doing this, someone wanted to do this, they wanted to start engaging audiences differently, what exactly what tips would you give them to do that very practically? Well, let's start from Shahara. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot. So Shahara very quickly was an answer to a problem that we had here, which is not only how do you package, but how do you sustain the work that you're doing. So it's an answer in two ways. And what we found was that if we were to create a platform that would allow for content creators across Africa, eventually, starting with Kenya and East Africa second, where content creators could create content, publish there, and get their audiences, the audiences that they've been able to build over time. So as an example, the audiences that Amabugane might have, get them to come and support them on the platform. That gives journalists and other content creators an opportunity to be able to support exactly what it is that they're doing, with the content costs, the costs for going out into the field, filming or sending journalists out into the field, costs of keeping the lights on, because those are very practical things that also interfere with you being able to repackage, etc. Because repackaging takes lots of thinking, lots of time, and sometimes quite a bit of investment. So that's the answer to the question that we had posed to ourselves. So I'll just share my screen briefly and show you what Shahara looks like. So it's fairly simple. It's like any streamer where you'd have your videos on here. And so we thought again that it can't just be journalistic content that's on the platform, because how many times, if you were to ask yourself, how many times in a week do you consistently engage with journalistic content? And the answer, if we're honest with ourselves, is that it's not the entire week. It's not even the entire day. You will oftentimes go to your, to watch different kinds of things. So we thought that this would be a place where content creators would be able to produce and publish content. So as an example here, this is an action movie that was produced locally, priced fairly cheaply at 50 shillings, which is about, let me see, that's about 50 cents, in US dollars. We've got, documentary categories as well as music. And eventually what we want this to be built up into is a site that not only publishes video, but also publishes text and audio. So hosting podcasts, etc. And that the text and audio version of the sites are coming along fairly quickly. But again, to answer the question of repackaging and why it's important to listen to your audiences, we had similar experiences where we've produced content that we feel is fairly good, speaks to every journalistic quality that we want to, but it's just not moving. And the example that I'd given earlier of the stuff that we had produced in Sheng was, the outcome of that. We had produced a lot of content talking about the debt crisis in the country, and it had moved substantially, but not enough for us to feel like it was getting to the younger demographic of our audiences, the 18s to 24s. We have a similar demographic to the one that Nigel was talking about. 65% of our population is under the age of 35. So we needed to produce stuff in a language that was understood and completely differently and narrative. And we chose to use a first-person voice when describing debt by using money as a narrator of the story. Those kinds of shifts and those little tweaks in the way people tell their stories allow for other people to engage with them and to see them from their perspective and their point of view. That, I think, is what it can be a game changer for journalists, so that they don't, and I think it also allows audiences to see journalists as not taking themselves too seriously, and leaving them out while they're discussing these very big and heavy topics, carrying them alongside them. And finally, I think the other thing that we're going to be experimenting with is different platforms. So can we produce an investigation on TikTok? How would we package that? Can we start to use our newsletter to build our community, the community that would support our work? Can we then now move on to YouTube Shorts and try and break down our content in such a way that people who just don't have the time to watch an entire 50-minute documentary will be able to get certain aspects of it or certain parts of it that then appeal to them. All of these things have to be on the table if we're really going to, seriously consider how journalism is going to survive, especially on the continent. But the final thing that I will say is that an impediment to that, because most of us and not all of us on this call publish online, is data costs, right? So data costs are just one of those things that are part of the infrastructure that we cannot innovate around. Eventually, they're going to have to come down. And so far, it looks like they might be, with a number of cables landing in different parts of Africa. But if we're going to be able to reach people in deep rural Africa, many of whom who have phones but just don't access content regularly because of high data costs, then those are things that would have to become a conversation between ourselves and telcos, as well as the government eventually. But again, that's really outside the purview of journalists to do, but it is a very substantial impediment to how we can get people watching or reading or listening to our content, which is what all of us want. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, John Harlan. I found that extremely interesting. And, you mentioned, and I've seen on your side, you mentioned, investigate, expose, and empower. Sometimes I find that investigative stories can be very disempowering because they are depressing, like super depressing. I work with investigative stories every day, and when I read, I go home depressed. Sometimes I cry. I'm like, what else? It makes you look like you have lost the battle. Like the bad guys have won, guys. We're in trouble. So I like the fact that, you're talking about documentaries, talking about ways to tell the story. I really like the notion of money, talking about money, telling the story of money. I found that really interesting when I saw it. So thank you for that. Nigel, I'm coming to you now, and I wanted to speak to practical tips of, what does it take to set up, this audience engaging network? What kind of personnel, what kind of financial resources, what kind of intellectual capacity, what investment in time, what does it really take to set up this kind of network that engages, a diverse range of audience? Because sometimes what we're used to is we put them all on different pages and the audience come and find them. But now you're running, like direct contact kind of news platforms. What does it take?
That's a very good question. And what I will do, if you allow me, is just to share this particular slide. This basically what you're asking me speaks to this particular slide that you guys can see, I'm sure. I'm a product person, like I said, so I we sit and talk about products, and literally what we're trying to do is you write a story, and like you said, you go do a really great story on climate change, and climate change is important, and that it's going to affect people, but the reality is it's not going to have the impact that you hope that it does if you don't package it the way that the person needs to receive it, right? So we basically look and say, okay, we've got these products, got our social media and our website and our newsletter, which we just launched, and a YouTube channel and podcast, and SMS is the next thing that we're tackling, right? Because we've looked and said all these people who are online, you and I are using this internet connection to have this webinar, but what about those who aren't online? Are we leaving them behind? So the reality is we've had to look and say, all right, there's this group that are rural, maybe SMS is for them, right? There's this group that's podcast, so let's ensure that people can download the podcast wherever they are. This YouTube channel, we find that certain content on YouTube will have high views anyway. So in a country like Zim, where we're highly polarized, highly politicized, any content on the opposition, the main opposition, right, is going to have great views. We know that already. Okay. Same thing go Facebook Live, if we go attend a thing, an opposition rally or press conference. So, and our social media platforms, because that's really where we started. You know, we started as, I started 363 Chat really as a discussion platform, you know, on Twitter and a hashtag. That's all it really was. So you add Twitter, you add Facebook, you add Instagram. You know, how do you, like what John was saying, uh, how do you, you know, add TikTok? Because obviously TikTok's a growing platform, you know, and of course our website. You know, I always speak about the website because that is the online state that we own, right? YouTube could close tomorrow and we'll lose all those videos. But if we've got our website, then we own that. And of course, our newsletter, we're trying to reach people using email. Like my dad, you know, is in his late 60s. He loves email, right? He loves a newsletter in the morning. So how do we package it so that people who have different interests or you know consume media differently? I'm a very visual person. So if you say to me, I love the African sunsets, as I'm sure some of you do. You know, I was in Benin and I saw this beautiful sunset. You need to show me the picture or the video for me to go, yeah, that looks great. So it's about tailoring the different products to still get that message across to say, listen, climate change is real. Here's an image, here's a story, here's a video, here's a podcast of the person speaking about it. And yeah, and then that's literally how we try to tell the story every day.
Well, great map, Nigel. I like the product thinking, because one of the things that I've also found that in journalism, a lot of times we do great journalism, we do very bad business. We don't think about product, we don't think about selling, we don't think about sustainability. We just think common good, public interest, you know, and people should just buy it because of that. But you have to sell it for people to buy it. People need to want it to buy it. So I really love the product thinking and that table. And still in that line, I'll move to Thembela now. And I wanted to speak to you, Thembela, to mention more. You mentioned that your ebook was very engaging and it had impact. So perhaps you share your slides now and tell us about other things that you've done that, and perhaps other examples of stories that really have impact. Because at the end of the day, journalism, I created a model that I called RUSH, which is report until something happens. Journalism, people want to do it because they want impact. People want their lives to change. People want to be able to tell a story of, oh, we did not have water in this community. The journalist told a story and, you know, look at our lives now. Otherwise, we become irrelevant. So apart from your ebook, what other ways have you been able to engage with audience or repackage stories in a way that made impact in your community? Over to you, Thembela.
Thank you so much. And I relate so much to what you're saying about impact stories. I was a journalist before I moved into digital, and I worked for a news organization that did exactly those kind of stories. I think I'm just going to share a slide in my presentation that talks about some of the things that we do at Amabungane. So one of the things that sets us apart from most organizations that do investigative journalism is obviously our advocacy department, which is ran by our advocacy coordinator, who's a lawyer. And what we do with our advocacy is we lobby, we campaign, and we exercise, you know, laws and litigate to help secure information and to create access to information and media, you know, freedom. And we say that is our livelihood of our field as journalists. And the priorities, so I list some of the priorities that we look at, which include beneficial ownership, transparency, media sustainability, political party funding, transparency, whistleblower and procurement transparency, and so forth. And this for us, advocacy is 1 in 3 of the things that we look at, which include investigations and also investigation training, supporting other news organization. And I think, I talk about the tools that we use in terms of achieving our objectives, which include strategic litigation and lobbying, as well as raising public awareness through writing of advocacy comments. And we don't do this alone, as AMAB, we do this work that we do with advocacy is very collaborative, and we work with many civil society organizations as well as other media organizations who also share, the same goals as us. It's important for me to say this before. It's important to say that, Amabungane, our advocacy mandate is circumscribed to transparency and media freedom issues. And we maintain, impartiality by not getting involved in the process that follows once wrongdoing has been done. So for example, advocating for the prosecution of those implicated in corruption. But we do, but our work does reinforce positive feedback loop, and it does allow for successful investigations and for access to information for journalists. And that's why we think this is, it's something that we do pride ourselves in. I have some examples of things that we've written. It's something that we do pride ourselves in, and to be able to have, funding to do this kind of work that opened doors not only for our investigative journalists, but for other investigative journalists in other news organizations, where they're able to get access to information and are able to do the stories that they want to do without having, the backlog, or without having to deal with such issues, because we've paved the way with other, civil organizations as well. So I think for us, it might not be a water story, but it might be that the good is doing something in an advocacy work that allows for more stories or more access to information for those water stories to come out, and for more communities to be helped through the work that we do in our advocacy department. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Tembela. Thank you. And you launched just where I wanted to pick up with Evelyn on collaboration. I mean, over the years, it has been clear that, collaboration is the new name of the game. You either network or you die. You either think of who you have to connect with or you cannot sustain. And I know Evelyn has done a lot of collaborative work on the FAIR. I knew FAIR when it existed. I came to the conference in South Africa then. It was a powerful force. And so I want you to speak to, in audience engagement and in actually, pushing out investigative reports and making impacts, making changes. How does collaborative journalism, out of collaboration, how does it help? And what examples do you have quickly to share? And secondly, I also wanted you to speak to, what you're doing now at ZAM, the power of, again, collaboration, but collaborating not just within journalism, but, with the hearts. Part of the work that we do at the center is to work with cartoonists and to work with photojournalists, to push out stories. So what, have you had experiences where, translations from investigation, maybe to poems or to songs or to other forms of art have, caused such kind of engagements that we can reference and that people can look to begin to think of collaboration, not just within investigative reporting and journalism, but beyond?
Okay, to start with that last question, we are really not good at that yet, but we're trying to get better. And one good example is an event that took place in Amsterdam a year ago when we launched our kleptocracy project with 7 countries, and Benon was actually there on video and a number of others. And we had a Nigerian colleague at the table and a South African colleague. And no, actually it was a good civil servant, because that's another thing I want to raise, that lots of journalists use civil servants as sources to expose theft of state budgets and mismanagement and stuff. But good civil servants are also a force on their own. They're often isolated and victimized because they want to give those communities who don't have water, they want to give them water. But because there is so much wrong in the systems, they don't manage. So we also had that good civil servant element there in our presentation, and we actually had a hell of a lot of people tuning in. And these are people who would not normally say, yes, I am interested in African sunsets or whatever. But because we brought it to them saying, this is kleptocracy, this is what it does. It is not corruption. It's not like it's a disease that all people in Africa have. No, it is a systemic problem where kleptocracy is often, as you say, the bad guys win. So that message, it comes out strongly from the collaborations and audiences in Holland, but also in other Western countries. They starting to understand those things, and that's important. But I want to also talk about the vertical. When John Allen and Nigel and Tembala speak of how do you work with communities, that's actually key. Even though we can't work with communities in Nigeria or South Africa or Kenya from Amsterdam, but the members in our network work with those communities, and they struggle with the same challenges that Africa Uncensored and Amabungane and Nigel are actually starting to overcome. And that is why we're trying to provide a bit of glue to get all these approaches together, to also bring the message to outside. I mean, it's not like, I think John Allen said it best. Journalism in Africa used to be a kind of a dry thing that people didn't really know what to do with. And I think people were absolutely right, because it was a damn dry thing. And there was often a lot of talking down at people. As a colleague from Ivory Coast said it very well. He said, all these NGOs and these journalists who are paid by NGOs, they come to bring us messages that we must send our girls to school and we must wash our hands and we must be hygienic. We don't have a school. We don't have water. How must we do these things? So yeah, I'm laughing, but it's actually very sad. And this talking down approach, I'm so impressed with Amabungane, John Allen, and I hear from what Nigel does now for the first time. That is what we need. We need that kind of tapping into the agency that people themselves have, and bring that together and show that not only in African countries, but throughout the continent and the world. And now I completely forgot what the first question was.
I was asking about collaborative investigative reporting, but I would go to asking to go around the room, because we have just about 5 minutes to Q&A, and I'd like us to take Q&A. I'll just like to go around the room, starting from you, Evelyn, and then I'll go to the next person. Like, your must say is like something you need to pass across, like, this is like so dear to me in terms of, packaging investigative reporting and in terms of reaching the audience, in 2 minutes. So we'll go around the room, starting from you, Evelyn.
Okay, you mean like examples?
Yeah, like something that you feel like, okay, I learned this on.
Yeah. Well, for instance, so what is connected to the talking down is a whole lot of preconceptions that we may have as outsiders or people who feel that we are intellectuals or whatever, and we're telling our audiences what our views are. One of the things is human traffic and sex work in general, and basically used from above. They go like, no, but women mustn't do that, and it's unhealthy and it's bad, and don't go with those traffickers, and all these warnings and signs all over Nigeria, don't go with the traffickers. We started asking women, what do you do when, women in poor areas in 7 countries, a total of 250 something women were just approached randomly by a team. And they asked these women, do you sometimes have to have sex for money? Because also you read these things about teenage girls needing to go with men just to buy cooking oil for the family and things like that. Well, over a third, and probably more because people would not easily talk about these things, over a third said, yes, I have to have sex with strangers on a daily basis. Otherwise, I can't feed my kids. So these are things that come from communities. And we must know this. We must not tell these communities what to do. We must know what they are going through. The other one that has to do with communities where I learned a lot is our guy in Mozambique, Estacio Valoy. We work with him a lot. He's been with the same community for years. This community is suffering forced removals because they happen to live on a mineral-rich soil. So whether it's diamonds or rubies or coal or whatever, these people always get removed and the company gets whatever it wants. Why? Why is the government of Mozambique or of that province not protecting these people, protecting their environment? Well, that's the question he's busy with. But this is how we got to working vertically as well as horizontally. We're now going to look at communities suffering police repression when they protest. Yeah, those things inspire me.
Thank you, Evelyn.
Yeah.
No, I'll move to you, Nigel. Please just share with us your lessons on this, like your last words before we go to Q&A.
Look, I think, I mean, for me, my second last slide has a picture of 3 feature phones. And I'm always thinking about the person on a feature phone more than someone like me on a smartphone. I'm always thinking of an African as a young person, you know. So they say Africa is young. I'm over 40, so I always think let's create content that doesn't speak to someone like me. Let's think of the person who's receiving the content. Let's tell the story so that they understand, you know. I've got all this education and I've exposed and traveled, but not the audience member may not be like that. So let's think about that. And then let's work, you know, like I like the word sustainability. Like I said, I'm an ex-accountant. So how do we do this today, tomorrow, next month, next year? How do we continue to grow and sustain the actual business that is journalism, you know? So I'm always fascinated. These are the things that keep me up at night.
Thank you, Nigel. I like the feature phone, the young person analogy, thinking of the receiver. Tembela, over to you. What are like your must say?
I think I agree a lot with Nigel. For me, it has to be understanding your audience. And sometimes we create content so much for ourselves without looking at who's actually taking in the content that we're putting out. And a lot of organizations put out, for example, I always make the social media example where you find organizations who put out the same information on Facebook like they do on Instagram and they do on Twitter, not understanding that there's different audiences in all these platforms, as much as they're all social media platforms, but it's not the same people that engage with it. So I think for me, it's very important that we understand who is consuming, you know, our whatever it is that we're putting out there, and then tailor our content or make sure that we engage them also in the content. And this also allows us to see which target audience are you actually missing, you know, and and how do you then engage with that target audience? As well as you asked the question about collaboration. I think for Amabungane, that has been one of the best things that we did. So we also, in terms of our publications, because we're such a small newsroom, have had a collaboration with 2 other big news organizations in South Africa who also carry our content in their website. And in return, we've managed to get our content across to more people than we would have if we only carried it on our website. So collaboration and being willing to engage in those conversations with people that do the same thing as you allows for growth for all of us.
Yeah, I like that collaboration allows for growth, and I believe across the room it's same. So John Allen.
This is a problem with speaking last. It feels like you're repeating everybody else's thoughts, but I agree with pretty much what everybody has said. You know, in terms of storytelling and formats and what ultimately it boils down to. We like to say here that the closer you get to people, the closer you get to your story, and that's true to the extent that we must always seek to find what story is most important to the people and try and be as true to it as possible. Then, of course, as Tembela had said, formats follow, right? Don't be agnostic. Third is a matter of sustainability, which Nigel touched on, and I think from my point of view, I'm now very, very, stuck into what could sustain our journalism. I think more journalists have to be aware that without money, without some sort of means to sustain and keep the lights on, then the journalism dies. So, we might want to try and focus on our public interest work, which is great and it's important, but we also have to apply a lot more thinking as journalists to what can sustain the profession, the industry, wherever you are. And it's not always one answer. There's a multiplicity of answers, and it depends from environment to environment. But as long as we are on the other side and being hardliners, thinking only about the story, then this is the quickest route to having media houses that do important work get shut down over time. I think the final thing that I will say is related to what everybody has said about collaboration. Find partners who add to the value that you already have. So if you're good with networks and perhaps not good with certain technical bits of an investigation or a story, find someone who can help with that. But it also has to be based on mutual trust and respect for one another. That for all of the collaborations that we've engaged with has been the one thing that has really saved us. More than even the technical capacity that either side has, it is the trust that you place in your partners to be able to collaborate. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much. We're going to go to the Q&A session now. I'll call Benon Oluka will take us through the questions, and then our panelists will answer.
Yeah, thank you, Martin Rayo, and thank you everyone for so many insightful tips that you've shared. There are a number of questions here that I have picked up from the audience. The first one, I will ask Tembela. Andrew says, how do you create a link between investigations and activism and making changes in public administration or solving crimes? My understanding of his question is, how do you go beyond telling the story to try to ensure as a journalist that, or as a media organization, that these stories actually have impact? You have pioneered advocacy, and I think you'd be best placed to respond to this question.
Yes, I think our advocacy person will be the best, but I'll try and answer to the best that I can. And I think I said it when I spoke about the work that we do in terms of our advocacy work and the things that we do look at when we are looking at taking on something in our advocacy. And one of the things is Cherise, who is our advocacy person, usually says is our advocacy work, I think I'm saying it the way she says it, reinforces a positive feedback. The more rights and freedoms we win, the easier and more effective it becomes for our journalists to conduct their investigations. She says it's something like that. I'm paraphrasing. So in terms of the question that he's asking, I think the work that we do, yes, we don't go and protest on the streets, but then what we do is we lobby and we get information for journalists to be able to use, like I said before. And I think that's also part of activism. And because we are an NGO, we are a funded NGO, a donor funded news organization, we're able to do those things, and we're able to do that. And we work with civil society. So the civil societies that we partner with when it comes to the advocacy work that we do are not all necessarily news organization. Some of them are organizations that do a civil society organization that do work in communities. And we can join them. Sometimes we join them in terms of pursuing litigation jointly, and or sometimes we join them in terms of being friends of the court, or they can join in terms of being friends of the court in something that we put forward and make joint submissions. So that's where we then become sort of like work with civil societies that are not really in the news space.
Okay, thank you. John Allen, there's a question. There was a question from Mora about he picked up on you mentioning that you can tap in, and then you responded to him in the Q&A box. You talked about storytelling codes that journalists can lean into beyond storytelling codes that journalists can lean into beyond just the fictional storytelling norms. That's a very interesting area that I would like you to develop, not in terms of, the kind of story that you've done using this approach. Is there something that you can help journalists learn from your own work that you've done in this area?
Yeah, sure. So, for instance, I hate to keep going back to the thorough example of the story of money. Is when doing documentaries like that, usually the journalist is the narrator, is the person who walks someone through the story. But sometimes with these kinds of formats, the journalist can actually be an impediment because they have to report in a certain tone of voice. They have to report in a certain kind of language that can be restrictive to getting people to get the message across. The second thing is, I'll give a really silly example here, but one that also used in this particular instance, which is the use of memes and really popular phrases in terms of the popular imagination of the public. Those things help get the story across far better than any turn of phrase that I've ever written or any other journalists have ever written. So it's kind of taking some of these norms that we see in popular culture and transposing them to journalism without losing the message, without losing the meaning that you're trying to put across, right? I can give other examples from other work that we've done that's more in the traditional lane, but in terms of documentaries, looking at the cold open that you have for a story. How are you going to push it? What is it supposed to look like? Does it look like your traditional news documentary, or are you going to try and dig a little bit deeper into the story itself and bring out something that helps dramatize a point without being sensational, right? So those are the things that I'm talking about. It's tough to talk about, in about 2 minutes, but essentially that's what I mean. The thin line here is that you run the risk of losing or trivializing some of the important stuff that you want to say. But I think what we have to be ready to do now is to experiment with different formats of storytelling and see what sticks, what works, because eventually the beneficiary is the audience and not some sense of pride in how closely stuck to the rule book in terms of how stories were told when you were in university, right? So I think it also goes in line with thinking about the audience. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, John Allen. The next question will be for Evelyn, who, as we know, straddles continents, Europe and Africa. You have been involved in content packaging for more than just African audiences. You've done it, you've even packaged content that you have developed out of Africa for audiences in Europe and North America. What lessons have you learned from your experiences that can benefit journalists on the continent. What is it that we can do as journalists in Africa that essentially, if I can borrow the word, make stories, some of our investigations go viral across the world or beyond the continent?
Oh, sorry, but I don't have a secret recipe for going viral. I wish I had, guys. I'm learning here. But what I think I have learned, what I find works when we try to sell a story somewhere else, is firstly, don't present it as a story about some individual bad things in one individual country. Because everybody will say, that is conform our stereotyping. And also I have never heard of a country called the Gambia or whatever the case may be. I'm talking about outside audiences. There is a hell of a lot of misinformation and lack of interest. So we battle with that daily. So present it as a thing that people, and you're actually bordering the fiction here, even though it's not fiction, it's just true. Package it as a story of, all stories are about good and evil in the end. This is a person who does not have water. This person's child died because they did not have clean water. There was cholera or malaria or whatever. This is not because she did not know how to wash her hands or how to wash her baby. It is not because she didn't know things. It's because some people or entire layers of maladministration are not allowing water to come to that child. And that is a universal story. That has nothing to do with that it was in a specific locality or one specific bad guy stopped the clean water. It is an entire system that is not working here, and there are good people in that system who have also had to maybe resign because they were outnumbered, or even higher levels made sure that they were removed. That's basically how I would do it.
Okay, thank you. Nigel, really quick one for you. It's from Nyira. It's on issues of sustainability. She's asking for what are the best practices for sustainability. How do you make money doing what you do?
So the first question there, I think, is the answer is ethics. So be as ethical as you have to be. Be an ethical journalist is what I'm trying to say, right? So we're turning 10 in September, so clearly we've done some things right. We have had many approaches from all sorts of people, politicians, business people, whatever, and they've all come and tried something, and we're still here. Sustainability, I simply looked at media group here, Alpha Media Holdings. I looked at organizations, the Standard Group in Kenya. I looked at we've used a number of case studies. Mail and Guardian in South Africa, Daily Maverick in South Africa. We've looked at my brother Dapo, Premium Times in Nigeria. We've looked at these various publications and said, how can we adapt, leverage, learn from them? How can we take some things that they do, tailor it to us? A lot of the times we've just had to figure it out, and we reverse engineered a publication, a print publication, and said, look, we don't have a print press, but how can we serve the audience? We looked at WhatsApp. How do we create the e-paper, which is electronic paper, that looks and feels like a newspaper that is sent on WhatsApp only? So we've had to experiment and learn, fall, get up, try again.
Okay, thank you. We are unable, unfortunately, to ask all the questions, but our speakers have been able to respond to some of the questions via the Q&A box. If your question hasn't been answered, please check there if one of our speakers has responded to it. I'll pivot back to Motunrayo, but before I do that, I'll ask you, Motunrayo, a question that I hope you can respond before you close. You are starting the collaborative media project, and usually this is something for local media organizations to collaborate. Usually when we talk about collaboration, with a lot of the thinking is that it's cross-border journalism, cross-border collaboration. What are you trying to do with this collaborative media project? How is it going to benefit the local organizations? And in terms of content packaging, are you going to reach out to the locals in Nigeria, for instance, through the use of local language translations for investigative stories? What's the approach you're using here?
Okay, I thought I was free from questions since since my role was to moderate, but I'll quickly attempt that. Okay, so we're doing something that we call the collaborative media project. In full, it is the collaborative media engagement for development, inclusivity, and accountability. And we are supporting 26 organizations within the country to do reporting at the subnational level. Our research shows that the center is saturated. Everybody wants to report the president or the prime minister or the people at the federal government level. But at the state levels of governments, people are getting away with more than practically speaking. And we just thought to do something that focused more on these sub-federating units and made them more accountable. So we're doing this in various ways. Yes, we're using local languages. Some of the partners are going to be producing local languages. Many of the partners are in areas that are more difficult to reach. We'll be talking about community engagement all day. A lot of times people sit at the capitals and then they report about rural areas without really getting to the people in that area. So we're working with partners who are in these communities and closer to the people to tell their story. And we're also telling and amplifying stories of people that are usually not covered in news, persons with disability, women, young people people in rural areas, just to get their stories out and to talk about accountability. And we have also found that, you know, when you're talking about these stories, a lot of times, I personally think, you know, the people at the center, they get too much media coverage. Like every time the president went to the bathroom, he's gone out now he's walking, now he's laid down. You know, people are tired of those kind of stories. People want to hear stories about people like them, what is happening to their lives, how are they making things happen. And so we want to tell the stories of the people more than we tell the stories of the people who we are holding accountable. So generally speaking, that's what the Media Collaborative Project is about. And I really believe that, just like we're talking about investigative stories and being big now, I believe that collaborative journalism is what we're going to be talking about the most in the next 5 to 10 years, because whatever form the journalism you're doing, whether local journalism, international journalism, you know, whatever form that you're doing, investigative reporting, you need collaboration. You need to think about the people you're going to work with, and you need to think about your community. You need to think in communities. You need to think about stories, and so that's generally what it's about. And yes, that's that. So let me go back to the mode of the person who is moderating the session. And we've gotten to the end of this. I believe that it has been useful for our audiences. We thank you for joining. We would not have been able to teach anything if we did not have audiences. So we thank you for joining. Also, I want to really specially, you know, thank Evelyn and thank Nigel, thank Tembala, and thank John Allen. I learned a lot from preparing for this session. I was looking forward to it. I believe you're doing great things across Africa that we can export to the rest of the world, because we're considered importers, but we know we have great things that we can export to the rest of the world that is making a huge impact. So I want to thank you for the differences that you're making in your communities and to the work that we do. I want to also say thank you to all of the back end people at GIJN that made this webinar happen, the rest of the team. So thank you so much for making it happen. And again, let's keep talking. Next month, we're going to be doing another webinar. Let's follow the GIJN handle. Let's also follow our panelists. Many of them have massive followership already, but we need to follow those people who are doing great things so that, you know, the good news can go around as much as, you know, the bad news is doing right now. So again, thank you so much. And we hope to see you at another time. Thank you.